Well, when I went to Anderson, we did not have rooms like this. I was in the crappy building that was next to the law school. I think it's been condemned now. So they built this literally 1 year after I graduated, which poured salt on the wounds of that old building. But I'm very excited to be here. What I want to talk about today is really what's happening in tech in LA specifically. So we have seen a real renaissance of tech in LA. It has been very much a burgeoning industry. And what I want to do is go back a little bit in time, talk about what it was like when I started a company in LA in the tech industry, what's changed, what it is like today, and then what's going to happen in the future. So looking further ahead. So I think of this really as 3 phases of growth of LA tech. And we'll start with phase 1. So what was phase 1 like? Starting a company in LA back in 1999, a tech company in Los Angeles. The best way to describe it is it was like being alone in the desert. There was really nothing here for tech companies. There was no mentorship, there was no capital, there were no resources. It was a very desolate place to start a tech company. Maybe most notably, it wasn't socially acceptable to be in tech in LA. If you were high performing, particularly if you were going to business school, for example, and you graduated and you wanted a job in LA, you go into real estate, or more likely you go into entertainment. Maybe you'd go into consulting or banking, but that was kind of it. You would not go into technology. If you went to technology, you would go north to San Francisco. The only reason anybody thought about starting a tech company in Los Angeles was because of Los Angeles, right? Beautiful place to be. I actually started the company in my apartment in New York. I was there for about 2 months getting ready to kick off the business, have the first meeting, and it was kind of a miserable place to be to start a company. It was a very lonely place to be in such a giant city where being alone as an entrepreneur was a very difficult thing to do in a city that was so institutional. And so when I said I wanted to move to California to really kick off the business, everybody assumed I was moving to Silicon Valley. But I thought if you could start a company in today's day and age, you could start it anywhere in the world, why not start it in an amazing place? And so that's why I came to LA. And if I talk to the handful of other people that were doing technology in LA at the time, it was a similar idea. They were here not because of what the city brought for the business, but rather what the city brought for your life, right? Great place to be, great environment, great weather, just other than the traffic, just great standard of living. But when you got to the business part of it, it was actually quite challenging. So one of the challenges was there weren't people here that did technology. So what that meant was when you went to hire people, you couldn't hire people based on their experience in technology, right? The jobs we had, whether it was so I built an enterprise software company. It's one of the largest cloud computing companies in the world today. Over 45 million people around the world use our software, and we help companies to recruit, train, and manage their employees. We're doing it for the Global 2000 around the world. But back then, we were a tiny little startup. And as a startup, you have to attract people to join your business, and ideally, you want people that have expertise in different areas. So for example, if I tried to hire someone for marketing, I would ideally want somebody that knew how to market to other businesses, right? B2B marketing in technology, ideally in software. The person didn't exist in Los Angeles. It was impossible to hire somebody like that in LA. So what you would have to do is you would have to hire somebody who you thought was high potential and hope that they would figure it out. And that basically was how the business was staffed for the first 7 years of the business. Literally high potential people, not people that had the particular skills that were required for the job that they were going to have. Because it was impossible to find people with those skills. People were not in the tech space. They were not at jobs that did the kind of things that our companies did. At the same time, very hard to get capital, very hard. So the companies that were started back then had to be very frugal. They had to be very careful about how they spent. In fact, very early on in our business, we were break even, very early on. Most of our financing actually came from the sales we were doing with our clients, and it was because it was difficult to raise capital. There weren't sources of capital in Los Angeles, and while you could fly up to Silicon Valley to go to Sand Hill Road and talk to the VCs there, the reality was the bar was much higher. The reason the bar was higher is because venture capitalists go to board meetings, and venture capitalists go to a lot of board meetings. Most startup companies have board meetings once a month. And so if you had the choice as a venture capitalist of putting your money in a company 2 miles away or a company in Southern California, and they were both kind of equal, you would think to yourself, do I really want to fly 12 times a year to LA? Or would I rather just drive down the street? You'd rather just drive down the street. And so there was a higher bar to get capital. In fact, we didn't get capital until the 8th year of our business from a venture capitalist. So we started the company November 99, I started, and the first venture money came in May of 2007. So that's a long time to run a business without real venture capital coming and helping you out. And that money came from Silicon Valley. It was very hard to get. But companies persisted. They were persuasive enough. They persisted, and they got lucky. They were in the right place at the right time. And there was a wave of companies that survived and flourished and actually did quite well. So there were a bunch of companies that went public, some that were private, some that actually sold out at very high valuations. And so you had your first wave of successful companies. We went public in March of 2011 on the NASDAQ and continued to perform today, about $3.5 billion market cap company. And we've been able, along with others in LA, to be that first generation of companies that were successful post the internet bubble bursting, right? Post that first wave of internet companies. This was the first wave of software companies, of enterprise companies, and of consumer companies that were successful. And that really paved the way for phase two. So what was phase two? Phase two is when the fun really started in LA. Phase two, you started to have first the rise of professional services that would support these kinds of businesses. So what do I mean? I mean lawyers and accountants and bankers that were based in LA that were supportive of building out this LA ecosystem. And there were some that were more aggressive than others. In the early days, PwC, very early on, built a practice specifically focused on early stage tech companies. Cooley came down, built out a business down here. Others were focused on building capability. Silicon Valley Bank was very early, helping to give loans and capital to people that were down here. You had the first wave of venture capitalists down here that started to invest specifically in LA tech. And so you start to have the beginnings of an ecosystem to help tech companies. At the same time, you had your first wave of mentors, right? They probably weren't this old as this picture, but you had the first wave of mentors who were able to literally help out the new startups, companies that had been through that startup phase, that had not just done the A round, but the B, the C, the D, went public or sold the business. And so they were actually able to help the new companies that were forming. In some cases with some capital, but really with advice to help people out, to understand how to avoid some of the pitfalls of starting a company and some of the challenges that you have. And maybe most importantly, you started to have people that actually knew how to do the jobs that were available at these companies. So you had people that actually knew what product management was and knew what a product manager did. You had people that understood how to market technology, that obviously knew how to build technology. And I'm not just talking about developers, I'm talking about developers that had operated at scale. It's very different to build an application that's going to be used by 10 people or 40 people versus an application that's going to be used by 40 million people. And so being able to handle scalability, infrastructure, and overall be able to operate the business and have the skills to do that kind of work. But maybe most importantly what happened is because of that first wave of success, you had a massive influx of capital. And so the venture capital in Los Angeles just skyrocketed. And this was a combination of the venture capitalists that are based in LA, that were born in LA, being able to raise more capital for their funds and build more successful VC firms, combined with some of the largest venture capitalists, most of them from Silicon Valley, actually establishing a presence in LA. So no longer debating about whether or not they get on the plane 10 times or 12 times a year, rather embracing it, starting to fly down to meet LA tech companies so that those entrepreneurs didn't have to fly up to the valley. They started to actually build offices in LA, create partners that were dedicated to Los Angeles. And at the same time, you had an increase in general funding, companies that were willing to look at LA as a source of technology and fund LA tech companies. And not just a couple of banks, but all the banks starting to make the trips to LA, starting to talk about LA, whether it's the investment banks or the commercial banks that were supporting and funding these businesses. So very different from an ecosystem perspective, which led to the growth of LA tech. So some of you heard LA tech referred to as Silicon Beach. That's because the first tech companies, kind of coincidentally, most of us started in Santa Monica. And so Santa Monica still is very much a core of LA tech, but LA tech has spread. LA tech now goes all the way deep into the valley, east past Pasadena and downtown LA, south all the way to Irvine. LA tech is wide. There's a big hub now in El Segundo. There is a big group moving to downtown LA. And there's obviously been a lot of success in places like Santa Monica and Venice, in Century City and Westwood. Almost everywhere you go now, you can find tech companies. Almost everywhere in LA. And this is very different. Part of the reason this happened, no big surprise, traffic, right? If everybody was in Santa Monica, you have contention for people that are willing to commute to Santa Monica. So some of the smaller companies started where the founder lived, right? If somebody lived in West Hollywood, they would start the company in West Hollywood. If they lived in Manhattan Beach, they would start the company in Manhattan Beach or El Segundo, somewhere down in the South Bay. And so you started to have this spreading of LA tech. It actually made it slightly more complicated for the VCs and the bankers because you would have to decide, am I going to Pasadena that day or am I going to the South Bay? Hard to do both in one day. And so you started to see smaller ecosystems forming, right? Mini environments that were being created in each of these different geographies. Now, as it's grown, it's gotten so big that these have all kind of blurred together. The boundaries have blurred together. The people have moved into these different areas. And you now see LA tech really everywhere. And you could go to almost any building. All the real estate brokers now are very focused on LA tech. Because if you guess right, as happened with my broker at Cressa, then not only do you get that first lease, but you get more and more and more and more leases with bigger and bigger needs for space. And so he went from renting us, I think our first place was 2,000 square feet, and now we have something like 120,000 square feet in Santa Monica. And so you end up with a real desire to support these businesses. And so with all of that support, with all of that help, with all of that capital, it's not a surprise that you had this second wave of successful companies. Now this shows a combination of the first wave and the second wave, but a lot of these businesses are now very large businesses. We now have in LA, for the first time ever, a number of unicorns. These are private companies with a valuation of over $1 billion. And there is now this large group of businesses that have reached scale, right? Hundreds of employees or thousands of employees. We have 2,100 employees. Businesses that are taking up lots of real estate, that are providing lots of jobs, that are supporting the ecosystem, right? All those people need to eat. All those people have service providers. All of those people and all of those companies are supporting the economy. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the LA economy. And there's no signs that it's slowing down. The capital's increasing here, not decreasing. And the businesses are getting more and more successful. And so this is a really good time now to be in LA. You have a number of public companies from Los Angeles. You have a number of companies that are lined up to go public in LA. You've had now many successful exits, some of them 8 figures, some of them 9 figures, some of them 10 figures. So we've had $1 billion plus exits now in Los Angeles. And so we're seeing a really successful ecosystem. And as you can imagine, this is a virtuous cycle. You have more and more people that are qualified to do these jobs. You have more and more mentors. You have more people that have worked side by side with successful entrepreneurs who then spin off and start their own ventures. And so this very much is a virtuous cycle where you have more and more success. But something else happened along the way. So the cost of starting a business went down dramatically. And this is actually really interesting because you'll read conflicting reports about this because it depends on the size or scale of the business. So on the one hand, it's much cheaper to start a company today. You could use cloud computing, you could use a public cloud, you could use platforms that exist. It's very inexpensive now, as you know, to start a website, to do some basic marketing, to build a very basic business. The infrastructure costs are much, much lower, particularly in software, which is the vast majority of technology companies today, whether we're talking about the internet, consumer software, or we're talking about B2B or enterprise software. That's the bulk of the technology industry today, and those businesses are very inexpensive to start now. They are very expensive to scale because of the noise, because of the competition, because of the labor shortage for skilled labor. They're very expensive to scale, but very cheap to start. And so you end up with two things happening. One, very low cost of entry with what seems to be a really good business to be in, right? So you have a gold rush mentality around tech, combined with a lot of capital in LA that was on the sidelines doing other things, whether it's the entertainment industry or the real estate industry or other professional services. You had a lot of people that had capital that could make investments of $25,000 or $50,000 or $100,000. And so you end up with what people call the seed stage glut, very much in Los Angeles. What does that mean? It means you have a lot of companies that were able, through friends and family, to raise money. They were able to raise $20,000, $50,000, $100,000, $500,000, even $1 million is not that hard to raise anymore. And they would start their business. And then they would get stuck. Why would they get stuck? Because there's still not that much capital in LA focused on A-round investments, and in particular, B and C round investments. And so these companies were able to get seed capital. They might have been able to get A-round capital, but then they would get stuck. They weren't able to keep scaling the business. They weren't able to get a B round or a C round. So if the A round was $1 to $3 million, the B round should have been $3 to $7 million or even more today. Today, B rounds are as high as $15 million being raised. They weren't able to scale the business. And so you have a lot of that in Los Angeles. You have a lot of small tech companies out there, companies with 2 founders or 5 people, 10, 20, 50 people that get stuck. They can't keep growing. And this is the seed stage glut. It exists in other parts of the country, but it's very real in Los Angeles. And it's not necessarily something wrong. It has to do with the speed at which, the velocity at which this ecosystem is expanded. And because of that speed, because of that velocity, you ended up in a different situation. But there's been success. There are a lot of companies that are very successful, and so that leads to phase 3. LA is now poised to be the number 2 tech ecosystem in the country and arguably in the world. We are already top 5. And depending who you ask globally, we're arguably top 3. We now have the capital, we have the people, we have the number of companies, we have the resources, we have the graduates, right? All of which enable LA to keep growing as a tech ecosystem, to have more and more successful companies. We also have a massive local economy to help provide some more of the funding, some more of the infrastructure, some more of the resources to build these tech businesses. You also have, no surprise, a lot of traditional non-tech companies becoming tech companies, whether it's a division of the business or it's the strategic plan of the company. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, Forbes asked the CEOs of Fortune asked the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies very simple questions like, what's your name and what industry are you in? 70% said they were in tech. 70% of the Fortune 500 is not in tech. So we are seeing now the ability for more and more of the traditional companies becoming tech companies at the same time as you have more and more tech companies. We also have one of the largest pools of tech talent. We always had one of the largest sets of graduates of tech talent. In fact, Los Angeles arguably graduates the most engineers in the country of any city in the country every year. The problem was many of those people would immediately go to Silicon Valley or Seattle. They were leaving LA right away. That's no longer true. More and more and more of that pool of talent is staying in Los Angeles. They realize I could start a company in LA or I could join a company in LA and be very successful here. I don't need to leave. And so that pool of talent is fueling these businesses. And it wouldn't surprise me if over the coming years, the grad schools actually get bigger, that there's more enrollment in these engineering programs at the universities in LA as this becomes a bigger and bigger tech ecosystem. And so you see this around the country, but also around the world. LA globally is now considered a major tech hub and will continue to be. And so that leads to phase 3, right? The future of this, which is people are coming to LA now, right? Whereas before, people were leaving LA to go to San Francisco, to go to Seattle. Now those companies are coming to LA. So Google, as some of you know, just purchased the West Side Pavilion. Now that's some serious office space, right? They took the entire mall. And they will sublet some of the space. It won't all be Google, but a big portion of it will be Google. And this is in addition to the space they already have in El Segundo and in Playa. You see Airbnb coming down here. Amazon's come down here. Oracle's come down here. So more and more of the big tech companies are coming down to LA. Apple will be here. Microsoft will be here. You'll have more and more businesses. In some cases, they will be here because they acquire an LA tech company and then use that to create a hub in LA to attract more talent. In other cases, they just decide this is a great source of talent. And this is happening all over the world. Tech companies are expanding all over the world to try to find tech talent more easily, in some cases to lower the cost of tech talent, but in other cases simply to actually be able to hire them. This is true even at Cornerstone. We have 6 development centers around the world. Not all of our developers are in LA, even though ideally they would all be in LA. It's just impossible. There's not enough people to fill all the jobs that are out there. And so this is true in Seattle, it's true in San Francisco, it's true elsewhere, and that's why these companies are forming hubs in LA. So what does that mean? What's that mean for the future? Well, it means there's going to be more competition. It means probably the salaries are going to go up for tech people. It means there's going to be real contention around employees, and we may lose one of the biggest benefits we've had in LA, which is very low attrition. Right? The companies that have been as successful as tech companies in LA have had very high retention of their employees. San Francisco and Silicon Valley, you have the opposite. Very low retention. It's almost impossible to keep an employee more than 4 years. And often, people will leave after a year. They wait till their first cliff vest of equity, and then they move on to the next company. And you see this all the time. You don't see that in LA, but maybe in the future you will as there's more and more competition. One thing that we're proactively trying to do is not lose one of the biggest benefits today of being a tech company in LA and being a CEO of a tech company in LA, which is the great collaboration across the tech companies. There's not a whole lot of competition between tech companies in LA. There's some competition for talent, but again, because people generally have very good employee retention, you don't see a lot of contention, so the collaboration has been very good. We want to continue to support and foster that collaboration. We've done at Cornerstone some very specific things to encourage that, like the LA Tech Summit we've produced a few years in a row, and the work we do with our accelerator, with our innovation fund to help support the ecosystem, and others have done the same thing. We also realize that we can avoid some of the mistakes that were made in other communities, and we can give back. And so I think you will see in the coming months the tech companies in LA getting together to start to more proactively give back to the community. And that's part of what makes LA a special place. It's part of what keeps people rooted in the city, and it's part of what's going to help continue to expand and grow this ecosystem. So thank you.